Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jesus Nava. I'm the Director of Client Training and Education for TradeStation Securities. For me, it's always a pleasure to be here. If you've been with the masterclass for a while, you know that we do three different types of masterclasses. We do a technical analysis masterclass. We do a strategy elements masterclass, and we also do a leverage EasyLanguage masterclass. Today, we're going to do EasyLanguage. So this will be a great opportunity for us to open up the EasyLanguage editor and try to program custom indicators and or strategies. Today's class is titled Draw Trend Lines on Your Charts Programmatically. So rather than having you draw them manually by going to the drawing menu, this is a way for you to use EasyLanguage and calculated values on a chart in order to identify anchor points for your strategy and for your trend lines. Before we get started, here's the usual disclosures. Keep in mind that every symbol and idea that I talk about is for educational purposes only. These are not recommendations of TradeStation. Past historical performance is no guarantee of future results. And of course, online trading is not suitable for everyone. We have the link right there in the chat, and it's also visible right here in the PowerPoint slide, www.tradestation.com/important-information. So today we're going to talk a little bit about trend lines and how trend lines are created on TradeStation. A lot of good things about trend lines that I'm not sure if you know, but we're going to use this class to talk about those basic elements of trend lines and how you can use EasyLanguage to draw them programmatically. One thing that I wanted to point out is that you can draw trend lines from studies or strategies. A lot of the words that you use in EasyLanguage are exclusive to a certain type of document. And I'll give you several examples. One of the words is, for example, when you plot a line of an indicator, like moving average uses plot statements in order to draw the lines on a chart. That plot word cannot be used in a strategy. The strategy would say, I don't understand what plot means. The same happens, for example, if you're creating an indicator, let's say, and you introduce a word like buy or sell short. Those words are exclusive to strategies. And if you try to use those words inside of an indicator, of course, you're going to get an error when you try to verify your EasyLanguage. But in the case of trend lines, those can be used on either a study or a strategy, which is very convenient. The syntax, it's applicable for both documents. Trend lines are programmable drawing tools that can be added to the chart through EasyLanguage. So that's exactly what we're going to take a look at. In general, you can do the same drawing of a trend line using EasyLanguage so that they are created automatically for you based on certain conditions. The price and other information from a hand-drawn trend line can be referenced through EasyLanguage. I did a class not long ago, and we talked about trend line strategies. The strategies that we talked about referenced a hand-drawn trend line, which is also a way for you to use EasyLanguage and have it interact with a trend line. You draw the trend line manually, and then the strategy reacts to what's happening to the prices in relationship to that line. But this class focuses on drawing the trend lines programmatically using EasyLanguage. Trend lines are anchored to a bar, date and time and price on both the x-axis and the price y-axis. When you draw a trend line, of course, you're going to choose a certain point on the chart. And that point that you click on is going to align with one of the candlesticks on the chart. So the candlestick, of course, has a date and has a time. And vertically, the point that you click on, of course, is going to reference a price on the price scale. So that's the reason why we say here there's three different data elements that go along with every trend line. the date of the bar that it's being anchored to, the time of the bar. If it's a daily bar, maybe the time is not as important. More important when it's an intraday, because every bar will have a different time. But at the same time, you need a price. Vertically, you need a place where to anchor that line. Trend lines are not part of the chart scaling process, meaning that if you draw a trend line and then you change the time frame of the chart, that trend line may disappear. All of a sudden, you find out that you have no trend line on the chart. It's not like, for example, when you add an indicator, that indicators automatically adjust the scale of the chart so that it includes all the plots of the indicator, like moving averages or Bollinger Bands. If you have a Bollinger Band that extends to the upper side or the lower side, and it needs a little bit more space, the chart will automatically adjust so that you can see the bands clearly. In the case of trend lines, they don't affect the scale at all. So if you draw a trend line that is detached from the candlesticks, let's say above the candlesticks or below the candlesticks, and the price scale does not correspond to any of the anchor points of the trend line, that trend line is not going to be visible. Another scenario is that you may draw a trend line and you click on the first anchor point on a historical data point. Let's say, for example, you're looking at a daily chart. You have daily candles and you choose a date in the past to anchor your trend line. Let's say that you choose a data point 30 days from today, 30 days ago. If you switch your chart, let's say, to a 5-minute time frame, TradeStation by default will only give you 5 days of historical data. So that anchor point that you selected 30 days ago, it's not going to be included in a 5-minute time frame by default. So by missing that anchor point, the trend line just won't draw. And you just have to be aware that if you have selected a historical data point in a higher time frame, let's say daily, weekly, and you switch to an intraday, that you make sure that you have enough historical data so that that anchor point that you clicked on is included in the data of the chart. Otherwise, you won't see the trend line. And I wanted to show you that here. So let me go here to a chart analysis and demonstrate what I just explained to you guys. And this is a little bit about trend line behavior and how they work on the platform. Let me go here to Microsoft. This is Microsoft. Let's say, for example, that I'm going to draw a trend line across these data points, these lows right here. If I go to drawing and I click on trend line, I'm also going to go to drawing and click on snap mode. Snap mode will help me attach the trend line to the data points of the chart. I'm going to click from this low and then click on this low right here. Okay. The trend line is an upward sloping trend line. And of course, I use 2 anchor points. One of the things that I'm not sure if you know this, but when you click on a trend line, there's little white dots that appear on the line. There are 2 of those dots that are larger than the others. If you notice, here's one, that's where the trend line started, and the other one is where I ended the trend line. So you can very quickly see where the trend line is anchored. So the first bigger box here is anchored to January 6th of this year. And the second one, click here again, is anchored to October 23rd, 2023. Now notice what happens when I switch over to a 60-minute chart. On a 60-minute chart, I don't have the trend line. The trend line is not there. It's because on a 60-minute chart, I only get 30 days of historical data. Now, if you remember, my first anchor point was back in January. So from this chart, I'm just going to load 1 year worth of data. I get a PD right here on the top left corner of my chart that stands for pending data. It's going to be downloading the historical data in the background, but I'm going to, make sure that I have January 6th on my chart. And once I do, I see my trend line running across the data points that I had selected. And if I squeeze the chart by pressing the down arrow key, I can see those original anchor points. So just a little bit of information about how trend lines behave. And if you draw something on a higher time frame and you switch to a smaller time frame, just be aware that you have to load enough historical data so that the first anchor point is visible. All right, let's go back here to my PowerPoint. Trend lines are assigned an ID number, regardless of how it was created. So if I go back here to my TradeStation, if I want to know what ID that trend line has, I just click on the trend line and I hold. You can see that the trend line number is right there at the top of this data tips window, and it says trend line number 0. As you add more trend lines, they'll be assigned different numbers. I go here to drawing, I go to trend line. Let's see that I switch from this low to this low right here. Okay, if I click on that trend line and I hold, you can see that this one is now trend line number 1. Okay, so that's something that you can take a look at any moment if you're trying to identify the ID of the trend line. This is very important on that other class that we did on trend line strategies, because the trend line strategies, you have to give the strategy the ID of the trend line in order for it to reference the correct line. Let's go over here to my PowerPoint, and the next trend line element is that trend lines can be adjusted after it is drawn. Very quickly, I can come here, click on the trend line, and I can grab it by the anchor points and just drag it to a different location. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to do, I'm not sure. Let's go ahead on this high over here, drag the other point here, and I'm going to drag it here to this high point here. Okay, maybe I want to, draw that downward sloping trend line connecting those highs. So very quickly, I can modify the trend line. And programmatically, you can also set those anchor points to be on different dates and different prices. Color and size and other properties can be set programmatically as well. The default color of trend lines is different than the one that I showed you here. I'm not sure what the default color right now, but if you notice, my trend lines are yellow and they're a little bit thicker than they are by default. And those are settings that you can change. You can double click on any of the trend lines, go to the style, and you can change the color here. You can change the thickness, and you can set that as the default. However, in EasyLanguage, you can also set those properties programmatically, the thickness and the color of the trend line. And we're going to take a look at an example and show you how you can do that in EasyLanguage if what you're trying to do is to draw a trend line. Multiple trend lines can be drawn on a chart based on criteria. And this is what you need to remember when it comes to creating trend lines. This is the syntax, or the EasyLanguage syntax, EasyLanguage code that you need to use in order to create a trend line inside of an indicator or inside of a strategy. The reserved word is TL_new. Let me go ahead and turn on my laser pointer. Okay, because I want to point to a few things here. So the main reserved word is TL_new. When you type that inside of an EasyLanguage document, it'll turn blue. And when words in TradeStation turn blue, it's because they have a particular purpose. EasyLanguage knows exactly what to do. And TL_new is one of those reserved words that turn blue because it actually generates a trend line. Now, it does generate a trend line if you supply the proper parameters. If you don't supply the proper or the needed parameters, it won't draw. What does it need? It needs 6 data elements, and those data elements are bar date, bar time, bar price. And it repeats again, bar date, bar time, and bar price, because it needs the date and the time and the price of the first anchor point, and it needs the date, the time, and the price of the second anchor point. The same anchor points that we've been modifying on the chart, those are the exact same anchor points that we need to provide inside parentheses to TL underscore new, so that EasyLanguage knows exactly where to begin the trend line, where to end the trend line, and it'll do it programmatically for you. As you can see, this statement ends with a semicolon. That's just standard punctuation rules for EasyLanguage. And all this expression is stored in value one. Value one is one of those pre-declared variables in TradeStation. And what it does, it just holds the ID of the trend line. Now, when you generate a trend line, it's going to return a number, and that's going to be the trend line ID that we also saw when we clicked and held on that trend line. And that number is going to be stored in value one. That's why we have this little container or variable called value one that's going to store that number. Hopefully this is clear. TL underscore new must be assigned to a numeric variable, I'm sorry, and will return the TL ID if the trend line was successfully created. So exactly what we just mentioned. So here's an example of how that expression would look. Again, value one equals TL underscore new. And notice the data elements. Date, 10 bars ago. So the 10 here in square brackets is 10 bars ago. The time, 10 bars ago. The low, 10 bars ago. And then the date, the time, and the low of the current bar. Okay, when you don't have the square brackets and the number inside the brackets, is just referring to the current bar that is being evaluated. We're going to create a simple indicator that draws a trend line, and then we're going to add additional conditions to that trend line so that we can, change that location programmatically. The last page here on this document. Oh, by the way, before we go to the last page, this is additional things that you can do to the trend line, because once you draw the trend line, once you use that TL underscore new and you generate the trend line on the chart, it's drawn and it won't move. It'll calculate on every single, candlestick going forward, and it'll continue to draw the trend line, and you'll have repeated trend lines on your chart. So sometimes you may want to change where the trend line begins and where the trend line ends, especially if you get a new high or a new low. You want to reset the trend line. This is the syntax to do that. So in addition to TL underscore new, which generates the trend line, you have the TL underscore set begin and the TL underscore set end. And this is just changing where the anchor points are. And in parentheses, what you're providing, the reserved word is the TL underscore ID. So you do have to supply what the ID of the trend line is, if it's number one, number zero, because it has to know which trend line is, making the changes to. And the begin, of course, you need a new date, a new time, and a new low if you're going to change it. And for the end, you need a date, a time, and a low as well. So the begin and end are separated, not as in the TL underscore new, where you have all 6 parameters inside one expression. Here we have them separated because in some cases you may want to adjust the first anchor point or, the ending anchor point. So it gives you the option to separate them here as well. You also have the ability to remove a trend line. As I said at just a moment ago, I did say that once the indicator draws the trend line, it stays there. It's not removed. So the only way that you can remove it is by using the TL underscore delete, which is another reserved word associated with trend lines. And you just have to provide the ID of the trend line that you want to remove. And this is convenient because sometimes if you're drawing trend lines and adjusting trend lines, you may want to remove, old trend lines that don't apply anymore. And last, you have the ability to set the size and set the color with those 2 additional reserved words, TL set size, TL underscore set color. You provide, what the ID is for the trend line. And for the size, it goes from 0 to 6, 0 being the thinnest and 6 being the thickest, and you can choose any number in between for the thickness of your trend line. And of course, the color, we have words that you can just type in. For example, the color cyan, magenta, yellow, they exist as words. But if you want to get a little bit more fancy and have access to, the million colors that exist in the Windows operating system, you can use the RGB function that allows you to set an RGB kind of combination to set the color. But many colors exist as words like white, red, yellow, magenta, blue. So all those colors you can just type in the word. And the very last slide also available in your PDF is how you can build that trend line study. First of all, we're going to open up the EasyLanguage development environment. We're going to open up the study, file new menu sequence. We're going to select an indicator in this example, although at the very beginning we said that trend lines can also be programmatically drawn using a strategy. We're going to write the EasyLanguage code, verify using the toolbar button, fix any errors if it finds any errors. And then once you fix the errors, you have to verify one more time. And then you apply the indicator to the chart to validate the logic with the corresponding indicator also applied to the chart. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because a lot of times you create these indicators and then you look at the chart and it's not even close to what you were expecting. But let's go ahead and create an indicator and see what effect it has on our chart. Okay, I'm going to go over here to my TradeStation. So I'm going to open up the EasyLanguage development environment. I'm going to go to Apps and click on EasyLanguage, and we're going to create our study. Let me close whatever's opened here. Uh-oh. This is the dictionary. Okay, so let's close whatever is opened here. And I'm going to go to the File menu, New, and then click on Indicator. This I'm going to call @MC for Masterclass, and I'm going to call this Draw Trendline. @MC Draw Trendline. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm just going to type in what we saw in the PowerPoint, which is also available in your PDF. Very simple line of code. Value 1 equals TL underscore new. This is what I was talking about. Once you type in the TL underscore new, then it turns blue because EasyLanguage recognizes that word. Inside parentheses, we have to supply the 6 parameters that it needs. Sometimes you get these tooltips that also tells you the same thing. It's not as obvious. It does say that it creates a new trend line with listed start and end points. So here we have the start date, start time, and start value, which is the price. So not very clear as to what you have to do inside of this yellow tooltips. So sometimes I just ignore it and I just type in whatever the reserved word needs. So I'm going to start with the date. And as the example we saw in the PDF, we're going to use a square bracket 10. Remember that square brackets allow you to reference a historical date. I'm going to go here, comma. Then I'm going to go to time, also 10 bars back. And then the price, let's go ahead and do the low for now. I'm going to do the low 10 bars ago and comma. And then I do the date again. Actually, no, this is the low 10 bars ago. I almost forgot the 10 bar ago reference. And then last 3 are going to be the date, time, and low. Close parentheses and end with a semicolon. So I'm referencing a date, a time, and a price for the beginning point and the ending point. One of those is 10 bars ago. Let me go ahead and verify this. And it verifies. That's the line of code. So if I go here to a chart, let me show you what that would look like. I'm going to remove these trend lines that I drew manually. And let me just see something here. I'm going to go over here to studies, add studies. Let me scroll to the @MC prefix, and here's draw trend line. I want to click OK, and this is what the chart looks like. There's a few things that I have to fix here, but it's good that it's happening to me so that you know exactly the things that you need to do to your indicator. The first thing is that if you notice, it opened up a black area at the bottom of my chart. That's because indicators are designed to go at the bottom of the chart by default. If I don't want this black area to appear at the bottom, I have to make sure that the indicator says that it's using the same scale of the data. So let me go ahead and remove my indicator here by clicking on one of the lines and pressing delete. When you do that on an indicator that draws trend lines, it's going to confirm that you either want to remove the drawing tool or the study. In this case, I want to remove the study, so I'm just going to click on yes. And in order for me to fix that, I'm going to go back here to my development environment, and I'm going to right-click on the code and go to properties. In the properties of the indicator, I go to the scaling tab. I notice that it is set to the right axis. So it's going to find an axis for my indicator, and that's why the black area opened up at the bottom. I'm going to go to the drop-down and say, I want this on the same axis as the underlying data. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to verify one more time. If I go over here to my chart, and I go to studies, and I add studies, okay, I'm going to go here to @MC, draw trend line, and then click OK. And this is what it looks like. And if I scroll all the way back here on this chart, what is happening here is that as soon as the indicator is able to look back 10 bars, it's going to draw the first trend line. In fact, this trend line right here, let me click on it. And this is trend line number 1,899. The second trend line is 1,900. And the next one is 1,901. You can see that the trend lines are assigned sequential numbers. I'm not sure why it started at 1,899, but that's the number that it started on. But what it's doing is that once it has enough historical data to go back 10 candles or 10 bars, as we instructed it to do, it does that precisely. So from here, this is the 11th bar. It was able to go back 10 bars and then draw from this low to this low. But the problem here is that it's doing that on every single bar, because you remember that the indicator calculates every bar, and that's why we have all these different trend lines drawn at the same time, simultaneously. And it's going to continue to do that because it's doing it on every single bar. Okay. If we want to change the behavior, let's say that we only want to focus on the very last one, we can do the following. Let's go back here to my code. And what I'm going to do is add the following expression. If last bar on chart. When you type in this word, notice that there's no spaces in between. You don't have to worry about capital letters or lowercase, because remember that EasyLanguage is not case sensitive. But this word, last bar on chart, makes the indicator wait until the last bar in order to calculate. If you only want one line and only look at recent data. If last bar on chart, then draw the trend line. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase this to 30, just to give it a little bit more of historical data. Go 30 days back. Let me verify. And once I go back to my chart, you can see that the trend line is drawn from this low to the low 30 bars ago. Of course, this is a 60-minute chart. So if I change this to a daily, then it's the same behavior. It draws from the low of 30 bars ago to the low of the current bar. Does that make sense? Now, we can change the way that the trend line is drawn. For example, as it is right now, you can see that the trend line is truncated. There's no extension to the right or to the left. You can change that if you want to. We talked about, words that you can use inside or that are associated with the trend line. We saw the set begin, set end. We also saw words that change the color of the trend line. Extending is also an attribute that we can turn on. So I'm going to do here then begin, because I want to have different actions here. First of all, draw the trend line, and then I'm going to do TL underscore set X right. Notice the reserved word. Set extended right is just abbreviated with EXT. You have to make sure that it's typed in exactly as EasyLanguage expects it. If you type in, the whole word extend, you can see that it doesn't turn blue, so it's not recognized by EasyLanguage. So some of the things that you have to remember and memorize about EasyLanguage. If you're looking for these reserved words, they're all available in the dictionary. I haven't gone to the dictionary because I'm just providing you the words, but if you go to the dictionary and you search for the word trend line, then you're going to get all the words that are associated with creating a trend line. So I'm going to set this set trend line extend right. I'm going to open up parentheses, and I have to tell it, okay, what is the trend line number that I'm going to modify here? The trend line number is stored in value 1. So that's all that I need to put in here in parentheses. And I have to turn this attribute to true. Does that make sense? So this is the way that you extend the line right. And of course, if there's an extend right, there should be a set extend left. Notice that it also turns blue, open parentheses, value 1, which is the ID of the trend line. And I'm also turning this true. And then at the very end, I just end the whole expression with an end and a semicolon. So when I verify this, it verifies successfully. And if I go back to my TradeStation, you can see that the line extends left and right. If we want to change the color and the thickness, of course, we can do that as well. I can just add or continue to add attributes. For example, a TL underscore set size. Is it value 1? And from 0 to 6, let's go ahead and make it a 4 to see, what thickness does it give us. And the TL underscore set color, and we're going to do value 1, and we're going to set it to cyan. Remember that my trend lines were yellow, so let's see what that does. I'm going to click on verify, go back to my chart, and you can see that the line is thicker and it changed color. So those are the two, styling options that you have in your indicator. Let's go ahead and go here and continue to add different things here to my code in order to programmatically identify, these trend lines or, draw the trend lines. This indicator, by the way, is an indicator that I provide or that I talk through in my master classes so that you can understand, okay, how to set the anchor points with a calculated value. The example that we're going to talk through today is looking at pivot points. When there's, let me go back here to my chart. When the prices have gone to an extreme and we either have a peak or a trough. So there's a low that is significantly lower than previous bars and following bars, that it creates sort of a pivot. And ideally, we would want to draw, those pivots from one pivot to another. So let me go ahead and reset the scale here. Let me remove, I'm not going to remove the trend line because it's programmatically generated. What I'm going to do is come over here to my EasyLanguage. I'm going to remove some of the things here. Okay, let me remove the color and the size. Although I'm just going to leave it there just in case, you want to play around with those values. But what I'm going to do here, I'm going to start declaring some variables. And instead of using value 1, you can create a variable that identifies the trend line ID. For example, I can say TL, I can do even trend line. If I don't want to use the TL, like the abbreviation, I want to know exactly what it is. Variable trendline ID is just going to hold that trendline ID. So if I want to use trendline, I just have to come here, and instead of using value 1, I use trendline ID. And here I use trendline ID. It's exactly the same thing. Instead of using a pre-declared variable like value 1, I'm creating my own trendline ID, so it's a little bit more clear to what it is, okay? And in addition to the trendline ID, I'm also going to be counting my pivots. So this is my pivot low count, which I'm going to start as a 0. And I'm going to also look at a variable called bars ago. So not only am I counting how many pivots have happened, but I also want to know the distance between one pivot and the other. Now, I'm only looking for 2 pivots, which is the 2 anchor points that my trend line needs. And that's the reason why I'm setting up a counter so that I can keep the number of times that the pivots have happened. And the bars ago is important too, because once I get the first pivot, I'm going to reset the counter to 0 so that when I get the second pivot, I know exactly how many bars have passed. And that's the reason why I'm setting another counter that says bars ago, because now I can reference these 2 anchor points. So it's a very, very clever way in the way that the code was written, because it allows you to look at these important pivot points. I'm also going to start the counter. Now, bars ago equals bars ago plus 1. You don't need spaces here, by the way. I'm just adding the spaces for readability. So this is a bars ago counter that every single bar is going to add a 1 to the initial number. The initial number of bars ago is 0. So on the first bar, bars ago is 0. On the next bar is 1 and so forth. And it continues to add 1 every bar that shows up. Okay, and now I'm going to do the pivot calculation. If the low of 1 bar ago, and notice that I'm looking at the low 1 bar ago because I want to be able to identify the pivot once it has happened. And if I go to a chart, and let's say, for example, that I'm looking at this significant pivot right here. In order for me to identify this extreme low, I'd have to be on the following bar to be able to identify, historically, oh, that's a pivot. That's the reason why here in my code, I go 1 bar back. The low of 1 bar back is less than, and I'm going to use a function which is called the lowest, because this way you're going to be looking at all the low prices of all the previous bars, and you want to make sure that that pivot is the lowest point of all the bars that you're referencing. So the lowest low of the past, let's do 20 bars, okay? Now, if I'm looking at this pivot on the current bar, I don't want the current bar to be counted, and I don't want the pivot bar to be counted either in terms of looking at the lows. I'm looking at the lows and comparing it to the pivot low. If I'm on the following bar or the bar after the pivot and I'm looking back, I don't want to include the low of that bar that I'm on. I don't want to include the low of the pivot. So I have to go 2 bars back. So I'm going to come over here to the code and make sure that the lowest calculation, it's calculated 2 bars ago. And also, I want to make sure that the low is greater than the low 1 bar ago, meaning that on the bar that I'm on, I want to make sure that that low is greater than that pivot low. Why? Because I wanted to have that pivot behavior where it's been down for many bars, and all of a sudden I'm on a bar that is going up. That's the reason why I'm adding here the low greater than the low 1 bar ago, then begin. Once we get the pivot, this identifies the pivot. We're going to do the following: pivot, low, counter equals pivot, low, count is not counter, it's count, plus 1. Remember that we were looking at 2 counters. This one keeps track of how many times a pivot low happens so that it connects the 2, so that's what I'm looking for. So this is where I start drawing the trend line. If pivot low count is greater or equal to 2, I can just say, equal to 2, but this is greater or equals to 2. And low of 1 bar ago is greater than the low bars ago. Let me show you what happens if I don't add this section, and we'll come back here and add it, then begin. So this is the time that if I already identified 2 pivots, this is the place where I want to draw the trend line. So this is my trend line code. Let me go ahead and put it up here. These are all, styling words. Okay, so I'm going to put it here. I'm just going to tap them so that I know that this organizes your code by, hierarchy, what comes first and then what comes second. So this, of course, is going to draw the trend line. And at the very end, I have to reset the bars ago to 0. Outside of this, this, of course gets calculated in here, because this end that I'm adding here at the very end connects to this begin. So as you notice, I have an if-then statement that is inside of another if-then statement. That is something that you can do in EasyLanguage. So it only goes inside of the trend line generation if it's found 2 pivots. That's when it draws the trend line. And it's using this, the trend line, I need to change, some parameters here. Now the 0 here happens once it finds the first pivot. That's the distance between one pivot and the next. So the counter that is up here that is counting every single bar gets reset once it finds the first pivot. Hopefully, I'm not confusing and not overcomplicating this, but it's just the way that the code works. In this case, let's go ahead and draw the trend line. This is TL new. Now, what is the date? The date, and this is something really cool. The date is bars ago. Remember that you have a beginning point and an ending point. The beginning point, if you've set a bars ago counter, when it finds the second pivot point, it knows exactly how many bars ago the first pivot point is, because we've reset that bars ago to 0. Now we do have to add a 1 here. What do we need? Why do we need to add a 1 here? Because if you remember, we shifted the calculation 1 bar back, right? And if we, this finds the pivot, and it looks at 1 bar back. So in order for us to identify or move or be able to, draw the trend line on the exact anchor point, we have to add that bar back here. So this expression, bars ago plus 1, goes here for the time and goes here for the low. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. And the same here for the date and the time. Bars ago, we need to be able to look back 1 bar. Okay, let's verify this. Cannot implicitly convert numerical to true false. Okay, and low 1 bar ago, I was going to say, let's go ahead and remove this for now. Verify. Okay, let's go back here to my TradeStation. This is what it looks like. That's an awesome looking chart. Of course, the indicator is calculating on every single bar. Now, in an example like this, I would probably, not extend left and right, especially here at the very front. You probably don't want all these lines extending to the right side or the right side of the chart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the code, and the extend lines, I'm going to comment them out. If you type in a double / that comments, the line out and is not read by EasyLanguage is going to be skipped. I'm going to verify it one more time. I go back here to my TradeStation, and this is what it looks like. So notice that is identifying those pivots and drawing the lines from that low to the next low. Now, one thing that it's doing though, it's also connecting the lows on a downward move, because we haven't told it, to differentiate, if one of the pivots is higher than the other. So that's the reason why we have to make sure that one pivot is, higher than the other. And in order for our trend lines to always be upward sloping, we need to make sure that the low of that second pivot is higher than the first one. And this is how we fix that. Let me go ahead and fix that. Let me go here to the code. And right here, when we encounter the second pivot, we want to add the following piece of syntax. And low of that bar that we're looking at is greater than the low of bars ago plus 1. That way, we know that we are in an upward slope. We need to make sure that the low is greater than the low bars ago, which is the first pivot. Let's verify this and then go back to my TradeStation. And now you can see that is only identifying those significant pivots and connecting from one low to the next low. In this particular case, we had it continued to drop right after. Let me open up my chart a little bit more so that you can see what happened here. The condition was met because we're only looking at the following bar. So in this bar, the criteria was evaluated and it found that this low was the lowest low for the past 20 bars. That's my criteria. After that, we haven't written the portion that looks at the strength of the pivot, going on the right side. That's something that we can, tweak here on our code. But I'm going to leave it for you to play around with the code to put in that criteria. But you can see how quickly I was able to generate a trend line based on these anchor points that are calculated programmatically. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure, presenting this content, and I hope that you walk away with something valuable. Remember that we do master classes every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure that you check our events schedule so that you know what the upcoming topics are, and you're welcome to register for those. We also do getting started classes on Wednesdays. So if you're just getting started with TradeStation, tomorrow we're going to talk about mobile apps. And I'm going to describe, the differences between our iOS app and our Android app, and how you can, place trades and manage orders and positions on those applications. So everyone, thank you so much for attending today, and I hope to see you in a future class. Goodbye, everyone. Great having you.